Going live. Okay, so welcome to another edition of WaveLab Pro Workflows. Today I have a very special guest, Pete Lyman from Infrasonic Sound in Nashville, Tennessee, and he's joining us today via Zoom. So welcome, Pete. Thanks for taking time out of your busy week, end of the year, probably wrapping up a lot of projects, but thanks for taking the time to do this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Pete's done a lot of amazing projects. We were just discussing, he did the last song that John Prine ever recorded and released in his last album. Weezer, Brandi Carlile, Sturgill Simpson. Did you do his bluegrass stuff, the cut and grass stuff that just came out?
I did not do that, no.
Okay, but the big album and the last studio album, great, one of my favorites of the year. Was that, I'm losing track of time, was that this year even that it came out, or was it last year? It must have been last year.
I think it was right at the end of last year.
Yeah. And then I recently picked it up on vinyl because I knew that you had cut the lacquers. So, but yeah, Pete's an amazing mastering engineer, and I wanted to invite him on because he's been using WaveLab for a long time. I mean, longer than myself, actually. So he's going to be able to share a lot of knowledge about that. But this is also going to be more of a informal interview. I shouldn't say informal, but just a basic overall interview about mastering, life in general, using WaveLab and things like that. Just a sort of a more lighthearted and fun way to end the year. So let's get into it. So how long have you been mastering full time, and did you get into mastering through recording and mixing, or did you just jump right into mastering straight away?
I definitely got into mastering through recording and mixing, but it sort of happened early on as well. I've been mastering for about 20 years, but really full-time mastering for about 15. Part of that, I was definitely juggling some tracking, mixing, production as well. So, okay. And even while I was mastering full-time, I kind of continued up until really about 2009, 2010, just dipping my toes back in the recording world, and I would occasionally take on projects. The first studio that I built, we had a pretty large, like 2,500 square foot recording studio, and then a separate building that was the mastering facility. So I'd still, like I said, up until about 2010, I still kind of jumped in and did some of the recording projects I was interested in doing just for the fun of it.
Yeah, I had a very similar story where I was getting more calls for mastering, but then that band that I really loved to work with would call me up and we'd try to sneak in a record. But I don't know if this happened to you, but I ran into kind of a time crunch situation where, I would commit to something, but then the mastering would just swallow that up. And then I just had to start saying no to projects, even if I really wanted to do them.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly the situation I was in. And frankly, I wanted to only master. That's been my focus for a very long time. When I still owned the recording studio, though, I also felt compelled to keep that portion of the business going. And oftentimes I just had to jump in and engineer because that's what we needed to do, Yeah,
it's kind of like whatever is going to help keep the studio going. And, at least for me, I didn't know where mastering was taking me. It was just like, I really like doing this. I'm getting more calls for it. Let's go for it. And then I just had to turn that recording and mixing switch off. But I found that I could refer those projects to, the right engineers, and they would come back to me for mastering.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for me, my entry into mastering was sort of more of a very old school approach, because I actually got into the vinyl portion first.
Okay.
I was tinkering around with 2-track editing and everything. I mean, I've always been interested in computers from a young age. So as soon as I was able to start manipulating audio digitally and go from working with, analog and 4 tracks and stuff when I was younger to being able to kind of merge my love of computers and technology at the time with music, I started tinkering there. But when I saw my first lacquer get cut, that had a really big impact on me when I met my mentor, Richard Simpson, years ago. And So I sort of went back and learned about the art of mastering that way, and learned how to cut a good sounding lacquer, and learned what it takes to make that happen. And then I sort of, got more involved in full album mastering and digital mastering from there.
And where was that, in California where you first got into that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In Los Angeles.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when I think about vinyl, it still makes no sense to me that it even works. And, growing up in the Midwest, there just was no way for me to witness that happening. In LA, there was obviously a lot of cutting engineers, but yeah, I was always fascinated by the vinyl process, but never had a chance to witness it. And now, I toyed with the idea of looking into it in the mid to late 2000s, because a lot of stuff I was mastering and working on was going to vinyl. But obviously, as you know, the learning curve, the availability of parts, the cost of maintenance is just pretty high, pretty intimidating, I guess, for someone that doesn't sort of have a mentor, like you said, to help get you into it.
Yeah, even now, vinyl mastering is sort of it's a tricky segment of our industry, because unless you're lucky enough to get into this when I did, like just acquiring the gear to do it, you're looking at, to get a good lathe up and running, you're looking at well over $100K and probably more. And then the learning curve to just to get to the point where you can cut a decent lacquer is going to be very, very expensive. So it's really not very cost effective for people to get into, which is a shame. I know that there's a couple people working on making newer modern lathes that might end up being more affordable, and we'll see how that changes. Right now, it's the cost of entry is pretty high, and it'll, even then, frankly, I don't really make any money cutting lacquers.
Okay.
It's not, I don't do it because, I don't do it as a moneymaker. I do it because I love it. And that was the whole thing that got me into this. So vinyl is just a sort of a value added service that I offer my clients, and one that I keep doing because I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, and it's great because, as I mentioned, I don't remember if we were on or off air, but when you master a record, you can also cut the lacquer, and you can make sure that the vinyl release is going to sound pretty true to what everybody signed off on. Whereas sometimes when people press a record, they don't always know about the entire process, and they find a certain place that might be farming the work out to this place or that place, and now suddenly the artist is one or two steps removed from what's happening, and they get the record back, and they're like, this doesn't really sound like what we signed off on. So I think it's great that you can just tell your clients, like, I'm going to cut this to lacquer, and you're going to be in good hands.
Yeah, we have, when we do that, we have we have almost no issues. I always tell people, regardless of where you go, make sure that you develop a relationship with a cutting engineer as well. If you're going to put this on vinyl, it's very expensive to do a record. So make sure it gets done right, because you may think you're saving a couple dollars by just sending it to a broker, but when you go through the pain of getting a test pressing back, like you said, that just sounds horrible, and then having to going back and forth between a broker and whoever they're using for cutting, it's a nightmare. So just, do it right the first time.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not, like you said, it's not inexpensive to do vinyl. So spend that extra 10, 20, 30% and just make sure you're going to be proud of it for the rest of your life. But let's shift away from vinyl. Did you get into mastering and studio work by being a musician first, or did you just get into it from another avenue? Did you play music when you were younger?
This all happened through playing music. I've been a music lover since as long as I can remember. And, I think around the time I really started focusing on the different elements of music around maybe 12 years old. And that's sort of when I was obsessed. Before I discovered punk rock, I was just obsessed with heavy metal. And I loved Iron Maiden and Motley Crue and Judas Priest and AC/DC and all that stuff. And I remember listening to these records, and I sort of remember this time where I started to be able to discern the different elements in the music. Rather than just hearing the song, I started trying to pick out what each person in the band did. And I still didn't have a total grasp on, like, I didn't really understand at that point, like, what does a bass guitar sound like as opposed to a guitar? Like, but I would see pictures of my favorite bands, and I would see them with their instruments, and I started thinking more and more about the individual elements in that made up the song, and sort of gravitated towards the bass guitar and drums for years. And I started playing in bands at a pretty early age. Started tinkering around when I started kind of taking drum lessons when I was 13, then switched to bass. And with bass, I was mostly self-taught. I had a friend that was a guitar player at the time that could afford to take lessons, and he would basically go to his guitar lessons and learn like Descendants songs and come back, and I would play along with him. And that's kind of how I learned to play bass. So I started playing in bands, and that sort of became the thing that I thought I was going to do with my life. Like a lot of us, my plan was, to play professionally in a band and tour. And I played in a lot of kind of indie and punk bands and did a lot of touring. And that's, oftentimes those bands just didn't have the money to go into the studio to record. So that led me down the recording path and learning about multi-track recording and tinkering with 4 tracks, and then with 8-track half-inch and 16-track half-inch and all these bizarre kind of more budget-friendly formats that I could afford at the time. And then all of that led me to a chance meeting with Richard Simpson and seeing a lacquer get cut. And that was sort of my trajectory, but it all happened because I was just a guy playing in bands, and I was interested in the process. And frankly, always frustrated in my early days, just as a band member, when we would go into a studio and I really didn't understand what was going on. And I always felt intimidated because I didn't understand what was going on. So I learned as much as I could about the process, and that's kind of how I ended up here.
Yeah, I have such a similar story of, being in a band, and we needed a place to record and didn't really have the money as middle schoolers, and had no desire of recording bands for a living, but it turned into that, just becoming that guy that knew how to record stuff. And I always wonder, and I wanted to ask you this, do you think being in a band or playing music helped you be a better engineer and producer? Because I know of a few producers and mixers that don't really play instruments, or at least they didn't at first, and they sort of learned to play maybe some keyboards or synths or background stuff to help their productions. But I also know people that got into it like you and I, where they were musicians first, then became engineers kind of by default, and it kind of grew from there. And how helpful was that in the studio when you were working with other bands from a mixing and recording perspective?
I mean, for me, I can't imagine doing this job and not having that background. Now, having said that, I know quite a few successful mastering engineers that didn't really have that background. And some of them had more like kind of geeky hi-fi backgrounds, which I think is really, really cool and really interesting as well. But for me, my ability to be able to relate and understand the recording process, but more importantly, understand what it's like to be a musician recording in the studio. So throughout the years, I've played bass guitar, drums in bands, a little bit of keyboard from time to time. And I've recorded all those instruments, and I've toured playing all of those instruments. So I have a fairly good understanding of the individual roles in a band and what it's like to be in the studio as that player. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, I feel like being in a band, just even if they were terrible bands, it helped me develop sort of my microscope for my ear of being like, okay, I think when you go to the F sharp, it's a little out of tune, or you're bending that string. This is more on the mixing or the recording side than mastering, but it just helps you identify problems or identify things you like and want to enhance. And I just couldn't imagine not having that background, but everyone's got a little bit different entry point and way of working. And there's people like, I don't want to speak for Rick Rubin, but I've heard that he's not the most musical person, and he just walks in and comes at it from more of a listener perspective or a fan perspective. And that's probably why a lot of his records are so great, because he hears it like the fans want to hear it. You know, when he's doing Johnny Cash, he's like, I just want to hear your voice and your guitar and a little piano in the background. I don't need a cheesy band recorded nice and clean. You know, let's keep it simple. So,
well, I think oftentimes for producers, that can be an advantage even.
Yeah.
I mean, I know a lot of producers that are also really good players and spent years playing in bands, but I mean, you can't argue with Rick Rubin's results. So exactly. What he's doing right. He's got it figured out. But I also think Rick Rubin is one of those. I mean, the guy's a genius. Like he's got it figured out, and this is his path. So, you know, well, he probably didn't spend a lot of time playing in bands. He sure did spend a lot of time like with bands and kind of developing them and you know, understanding what it's like to be a band. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I want to talk too a little bit about just the year in general. I know Nashville was hit pretty hard. A lot of people may have forgotten this, but you got a pretty bad tornado in like February, was it?
Yeah. I mean, right before COVID, you know, the devastating tornadoes in East Nashville that took out a lot of structures and a lot of homes. And, you know, this town really was coming together to get out there and help recover from this. And then COVID hit, I mean, pretty much during the cleanup from this disaster.
Yeah. Were you out of power for a few days, or were you...
I was out of power for a few days, and we ran the studio off a large generator that we rented from a post house. Wow. I had God, I can't remember what record it was. It was a big record. It had to be done. So we rented a massive generator and spent a couple hours wiring things up to get it to run. And it worked out well. But yeah, so far my experience in Nashville is you definitely have to be prepared. The power grid here is real funky. The power goes out quite a bit.
Interesting.
There are a lot of storms, a lot of tornadoes. So that's something you kind of have to be prepared for. But yeah, it was just awful. You know, living in California for so long, you forget about tornadoes. I mean, California we're busy dealing with fires and earthquakes, and you forget how devastating tornadoes are. And growing up as a young kid, I lived in Minnesota for a while, and obviously I grew up with, you know, tornado drills and dealing with tornadoes, but it had been a long time, and there's been quite a few scares in the 3 years I've been here. But the East Nashville situation was just horrible, really, really tough.
Yeah, and then with the virus, you know, the venues got physically devastated, and then they got financially hit. And luckily, I feel like in mastering, we were pretty sheltered from any of the shutdowns and slowdowns. I mean, I don't think if anything, I may have saw an increase in work because people are digging up live records that they never put out, or obviously recording at home, doing a lot more singles and albums. But did you experience any kind of slowdown, or is it pretty, from a business standpoint, pretty steady?
We were prepared for a slowdown. And I remember talking to some of my colleagues and talking to some of the producers I work with. And I was just talking to one of them the other day, and it's funny. It's not funny. It's strange because we weren't prepared for this, but we've had our busiest year ever by far. I can't, off the top of my head, I don't know what percent increase, but it's been very busy. so I feel very fortunate that we've been able to keep working. We also have a small crew here. There's mostly just me, my assistant, my manager on site, and this is sort of our little COVID bubble.
Right.
So we're all really careful. We pretty much go from work to home, and knock on wood, we're able to keep everything going. We get tested frequently, so we're able to keep the work going and also have a little bit of a sense of normalcy at work, which helps out because everything else is just so crazy right now.
Yeah, exactly. I feel super. I remember mastering an album in March and thinking, I wonder if this is going to be the last album I master this year, and thankfully it wasn't. But I really feel for the recording studios that rely on groups of people coming in from who knows where, and sometimes flying in, or just can't do that stuff really right now. And
well, they're doing it here in Nashville. No one's told anyone here.
Yeah, I have heard that Tennessee's on the rise again with cases, but I was just curious how I'm glad to hear things are on the up and up with you guys, or staying steady, and that you're having a fairly busy year, and glad that you and your team are safe and healthy too, because it's kind of it's just the unknown is what's the scary part.
Yeah, I think we're all anxious for this to be over. I feel yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it looks like there's light at the end of the tunnel, which is great. So
yeah. So you touched on this a little bit, but you said well, I guess you didn't give us a time range, but how much time are you spending cutting lacquers versus just mastering for the digital realm?
Oh, it ebbs and flows. It's funny. There were times during the summer where I wouldn't cut a lacquer all week.
Okay.
And that's also because I tend to, there's certain days where we don't cut lacquers. We pretty much only cut lacquers Monday through Wednesday. And that is specifically to ensure that our lacquers are processed by the plating facility as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
We don't, that to me is one of the most important aspects of vinyl production that gets left out. So when we're working with new clients, we strongly suggest that they use our partners over at Welcome to 1979 for plating. They're 10 minutes away from here, so we sort of have a situation with them where we cut the lacquers and they get the electroplating process starts the same day. So having said that, we try to, when we're cutting lacquers, I try to pack in 3 days with mostly lacquer cutting.
Yeah, and for those that aren't familiar with the process, it's my understanding that you have sort of a short window. I don't know if it's 24 hours or a day or two, but after that, you can have some high frequency roll off if the lacquers sit too long, and you obviously don't want them sitting on a UPS truck on a hot weekend somewhere if you're shipping the lacquers.
Yeah, there's so many things that could happen. Even on, well, especially in the summer, sitting on a hot UPS truck and then going on an airplane where they go from super hot to super cold and then back to super hot again. And during that time, the lacquer is essentially, after you cut it, trying to rebound and go back to its original form. So the groove walls are moving. It's a giant mess. So it's important to process as quickly as possible. So, to kind of answer that question, right now we're cutting a ton of lacquers. So, frankly, I haven't really been keeping track. I just sort of come in and look at my schedule for the day and do the work.
Yep.
Right now it's quite a bit of lacquers. We're also doing a pretty massive remaster reissue project for a label right now, like pretty much the whole catalog. So that's been really fun because a handful of those jobs are, all analog AAA vinyl mastering. So we're doing everything straight off tape.
Well, that's great that you can just take them right across town and get them plated, and then can sleep at night knowing that they're safe and sound. Are there any features of WaveLab specifically that help you feed into your lathe? I mean, do you play from WaveLab into your lathe, or is there another method that you use?
I play straight out of the audio montage. The audio montage is set up perfectly for vinyl cutting.
Okay.
So if you want, we can talk a little bit about my vinyl process.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, so one of the things I love about WaveLab is that it gives me the flexibility to easily create a record image that's more suitable for vinyl. So what I mean by that is on certain, typically for a digital master, where most artists want it kind of loud and a little punchier, and oftentimes we don't need all that digital level and extra limiting and compression for the vinyl version. In fact, an overly limited record tends to sound pretty bad on vinyl. So because I apply most of my loudness processing, my limiting, I apply that at the end, and I can kind of talk about that process more later, but I'm able to save an image with no digital limiting on it that is the foundation for my vinyl master.
Okay, yeah, I do a very similar thing. And have you had people, I've had people send me, their loud digital masters asking me if I can kind of prep it for vinyl. And usually the answer is no, because it's already been squashed. And I don't have the luxury of undoing the limiting, because I didn't do the original mastering. So that's where it's handy for you to be not only doing the mastering, but not printing the limiting, because you can have that flexibility of obviously having the louder digital master that everyone seems to love. And then you can take that off and have the vinyl, just sound so much better.
Exactly. And there's, in my opinion, and I know everyone has their own workflow, but for me, there is absolutely no reason to capture a track when I'm mastering with limiting. There is no advantage to doing that. So typically my process in general, well, getting back to your specific question regarding vinyl, one of the really cool things about WaveLab, specifically in the audio montage window, is that it allows me to prep an album and apply any extra vinyl processing I might need to do. So maybe some extra high frequency limiting, selective de-essing. I can do a lot of that with my analog captures. So I'll go in and maybe selectively de-ess certain sections that I know will aggravate the cut and cause issues. I'll take care of those. I do that all on one track in the audio montage.
Okay.
Then once I have that exactly how I want it, I duplicate that track and I route the bottom track to the preview section of my lathe, and then I offset the modulation track by 900 milliseconds. So the reason I do that, and I need to get into a little bit of how the cutting lathe works so people understand that. But in order for a lathe to manage the space on a lacquer, there's a system, a computerized system that packs the groove in, and it nestles the next portion of the groove right up against the previous portion and maximizes the land on the record. So it allows you to cut a louder record and keep from cutting into other portions of the groove, and it just maximizes the space. So the way the lathe does that is you feed the lathe two stereo feeds. One feed controls the computer, and the other feed goes straight to the cutting head, the modulation feed, and the cutting head feed is delayed. And it depends on the lathe you run. Every lathe has a different delay time. I use a system called Pitch 13, and that has a 900 millisecond delay. So it gives the computer just enough time to understand what's going on and make the appropriate adjustment while it's getting cut. So being able to do that in WaveLab, historically, there's a lot of different ways that people have done that. Some people use a digital delay line in their path and then split it. I choose not to do that because I don't like to go through any extra conversion. And of course, even with a digital delay line, there's ways you can avoid an extra round of conversion. But I have enough converters here that it's super easy for me just to duplicate it and send 2 feeds to the lathe. But it also allows me to do interesting things to the preview. So for instance, if I'm cutting a really long record and I want to trick the computer into thinking a passage is louder or quieter, so I could either pack the grooves closer than the computer would want or widen them for some reason, I can just volume ride the preview track to force the computer to make changes it wouldn't normally change.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds great. And this is slightly off topic, but I feel like there's an internet myth that, even if you're sending 96K files to get cut to Lacquers, that it's going through this antiquated digital delay line and conversion like you mentioned. But are you saying that when you're cutting, your high sample rate audio is going directly to the cutter head without any conversion?
No conversion, always direct off the direct off the console through the DAC. Yeah, there's zero conversion. If we mastered 2496 files, if we mastered 192, we're cutting from the one true full resolution files.
Yeah, and I think people that people like ourselves that work on a lot of vinyl projects, we understand that, but I think some people don't realize that vinyl, the lacquers can be cut from a much higher sample rate than like a CD master or even a digital distribution master. So that's an advantage. And I've also heard people say that, what's the point of buying new vinyl that was digitally recorded, mixed, and mastered? But I think for reasons you mentioned, new vinyl can sound great because, for one, it's not cut from something that's brick wall limited, which is more of a taste thing, but I prefer stuff that's not super squash. So sometimes the vinyl sounds better just in that regard, that it breathes a little more.
Yeah, I never understood that argument. Like, oh, well, it was recorded digitally, so why bother put it on vinyl? Well, the instruments weren't digital, probably, unless they were all in the box. Drums aren't digital. Vocals aren't digital. Sure, they ended up being converted at some point, but that argument to me is just insane. You've got, like, take a rock band, for instance. You've got organic instruments, and sure, they're being captured in the digital domain, but they went through all this analog gear, through a microphone. Just because they were captured digitally instead of tape, I just don't get that argument.
Yeah, maybe I think we need to wait a decade or two until the people that remember the first digital recordings are no longer around to make those arguments. Because, digital wasn't amazing in the mid to late 80s, but these days I think it's perfectly adequate. And I have no qualms about buying a vinyl record that was recorded digitally as long as it's well cut and, well produced and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of these opinions are, like you said, that early days of digital were pretty harsh, and on the other hand, though, like as I'm doing more and more AAA sort of cuts for clients that don't want to head into the digital domain, it's really beautiful to be able to cut an all analog project, not turn the computer on. There's something to be said for that process. There are a lot more limitations when you do something like that, because obviously we don't have the forensic tools available to us that we do digitally, where we can almost do anything in the digital domain. So I do appreciate the limitations, but if the record's good and it's been mastered well and there was care taken at the vinyl process, then it should be good. But getting back to what you said earlier, there are so many records that are coming out, and frankly the vinyl is an afterthought. The band goes into the studio, they record the record, and they're like, oh, we got to make vinyl. So here's we got the vinyl master, we got the master from so and so, let's send it to this broker or straight to the plant and just see what we get back. And half the time, as long as the record is playable, they don't really care because it's just another widget. It's just a thing for them to sell. And that sort of stuff poisons the vinyl industry.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a perfect segue into my next question. But, you can spend all day reading on the internet how to master for vinyl and things to do, but there's also a lot of myths, like monoing the low end always for every single project, that you absolutely have to do. And you want to give us kind of like a couple minute crash course and just what to do, what not to do when you're preparing something that you've mastered for vinyl. And as I mentioned, if someone's mastered it for digital, like, you talked about, and they've squashed it and it's super loud, there's not a whole lot you can do with that and undo it. You kind of have to be the person that already mastered it and didn't paint themselves into a corner with limiting, where you can open up another session and branch off, or you have to remaster it from scratch, which is often not ideal because now you're sort of trying to recreate what someone already did. I've had people approach me and say, I could try to do this, but you'd probably be better off contacting the person that mastered it. If they've been doing it for a while, they would know how to prepare something for vinyl for you, and be a lot more cost effective, and it would be more kind of in tune with the digital master. There'd be more cohesive. So if you want to give us a little crash course of what, dispel any, I'm sure you've seen all the myths too.
Yes, for sure. Sorry about that. It looks like I've got I've got text bumping into my system here. Yeah, trying to figure out where to start because this is definitely a can of worms. Let's start with how, as a mastering engineer, how you should prep files for vinyl. Okay. Like I discussed earlier, it's always best if you can make a version with less limiting. Now, I can cut with, I can cut files that have limiting on them, and oftentimes the limiting is a huge part of the sound of that track, and if that's what's intended, then you kind of need to roll with it. But over limiting, and especially clipping can be an issue. If a track has been clipped too hard in mastering, a cutting head doesn't understand how to cut square waves. That will just turn into distortion. So anytime, if you can prep a version that has less clipping, less loudness, pay extra attention to sibilance and overly excessive high frequencies, and you'll be fine. Getting back to what you said about some of this information you read online and on Gear Sluts and forums about, always having to roll off the low end and mono the bass, and it's all garbage. Don't listen to any of it. So the only time you should be doing that is if you're a cutting engineer. Every cutting engineer has a different system and different methods. If you're prepping something, don't apply mono filtering. Don't start applying generic elliptical filters because you read somewhere that that's what you're supposed to do. What you need to do is, even as a mastering engineer, develop a relationship with a colleague that's a cutting engineer and start to talk to them about this process. And you'll probably both learn a lot along the way, and you'd be surprised. You probably have to do a lot less to those files than you think. Every cutting system is different. So on one system, someone might have to apply elliptical filtering at 150 cycles just to get it to cut. And then maybe on another system, they don't have to apply any. So, unless you're doing some crazy electronic music with like complete out of phase bass drums that are stereo pan, yes, there are certain things that are uncuttable. There are certain production choices that might not work for vinyl, but in my opinion, that's when the cutting engineer gets it and says, hey, this isn't going to work, but here's what we can do to make it work. And as long as everyone understands that occasionally there'll be processing that we have to do that may kind of change the vibe of the track a little bit, but those are few and far between. In general, like 95% of productions are going to be just fine.
Yeah, and that's been my advice. Make a great master, develop a relationship with the cutting engineer, because they're really the only ones that know how it's going to go down, and the length of the side can have a huge influence on it too, from my understanding. Something that works at 18 minutes might not work well at 22, or the songs at the end you may have to treat differently. If they have some sibilance near the end, maybe that isn't a problem in the digital realm. That could be a problem in the vinyl realm at the end of a long side. So I think that's the main takeaway, is just don't do anything just because you read it on the internet, and develop a relationship with someone that's going to have your back, and they can write back to you and say, hey, I just got this and I'm a little concerned that this could be happening. So do you want to adjust it, or do you give me permission to roll up my sleeves a little more and make it work? And I usually say, yeah, you're the expert. So if you think and you're willing to do this, let's do it and make it work on vinyl.
Exactly. That's, it takes a team to do this. And that's why I always say, if you're doing a record and you don't know who's cutting the lacquers, that is a huge problem. You need to make sure that you have direct interaction with that person. Otherwise, most of the time it's not going to work out, honestly.
Yeah. My analogy is, it would be like, putting out a CD and just sending your unmastered mixes to the CD plant and hoping they do a good job of assembling it and mastering it. And, everything's so subjective. It could be great or not great.
That's funny. I've used that example a bunch of times. That's exactly how I feel. But the irony of that is that CDs are cheap to make. Vinyl is not. So it would make more sense to do that on a CD than it would vinyl.
Yeah, because vinyl's expensive to backtrack. That's why if you're hearing the test pressing for there's a lot of backtracking if any changes need to be made. But let's get into some WaveLab stuff.
Sure.
You've been in a moment I'll have you share your screen, but I just wanted to ask, when did you first started using WaveLab, and were you using anything before WaveLab for mastering, or was that kind of your first mastering DAW and you just stuck with it the whole time?
Yeah, it's been most of the time. I was kind of briefly using SoundForge in the early 2000s. Okay. And I've been a Cubase user for a long time. So before I did any of this, my sort of secret double life, as I was a guy playing in dumb punk bands, I was a middle manager for a pretty big IT company. So I would work all day at this weird tech job, and then I would go play shows at night, and I would save up all my vacation time so I could tour. So I was kind of a computer geek early on. From the time I was a kid, my dad was really interested in computers, and but because I was involved in telecom and the IT world, I was a PC person. I didn't own my first Mac till probably 11 years ago. So I sort of gravitated towards Cubase because I knew it was really solid on a PC. And I did a lot of early recordings in Cubase, and it just always seemed really intuitive to me. And that was my pathway to WaveLab, was Cubase. Okay. I started doing a little bit of research, and I got into WaveLab on PC, and frankly, even now I am still, I own, I'm sitting in a room right now with a PC and a Mac, but I do all of my audio, everything on WaveLab is still PC because that's just what makes sense to me.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I had the opposite experience where I kept hearing about WaveLab, and I even asked another mastering person from the area what they use, and he said, I use WaveLab, but it's PC only, and at the time he didn't see that ever changing, and then thankfully 2010 or 11 it came out on Mac, and that was the perfect timing for me to jump in, because it was everything I was looking for. I didn't necessarily, I was still recording and mixing, so I didn't necessarily have the resources to get a whole different computer rig.
Yeah.
Just for the mastering stuff. And I know Windows can be a little touchy with some of the settings to make it, and maybe I'm wrong there, but I feel like, there's some BIOS settings and things that get in under the hood that are a little over my head to make it. Whereas Macs tend to be a little more right out of the box. They're ready to go.
You're 100% right on that. It is kind of a pain in the ass to deal with PCs for audio. I've learned a lot of tricks over the years, and my amazing assistant, Dan Bacciagalupi, knows a lot of them. He runs PC too, but I run a custom-built PC that he helped me build, and he went in and tweaked all of that stuff. So there's a little bit of trial and error, but I run the same sort of. I'm always running. I've been using RME interfaces for years, so I use an RME PCIe card in a Thunderbolt chassis, and that kind of helps with stability. Like we have a pretty good understanding of what we need to do to Windows to make sure that everything is rock solid, and the RME stuff is super solid.
I agree. I have an RME card at my main setup, and it was so great and stable. I had to get it from my home setup, and that way I can bounce between home and the studio, and all my routing just is it's the same, so I don't really have to play around with settings. I can just stop working at the studio, pick it up from home, and all my routing is the same. Obviously, I don't have the same analog gear at home, but the routing is all for reference tracks and stuff like that. And you mentioned, I think I saw you mention on the internet somewhere that sometimes when you go back to LA, are you able to just bring a computer and you're up and running, or do you just have another computer and mirrored over there?
So what I did for a very long time, this is going to sound crazy. It's a super convoluted setup, but in LA for years, I ran my entire setup off a MacBook Pro Retina laptop with a Thunderbolt chassis. So I bought, I spent like $5,000 on the most souped up laptop I could get, and ran everything on the Thunderbolt chassis. And my laptop just sat in a docking station in the machine room. And it worked great. I mean, it didn't really, at this point, laptops are so quick that it didn't really make a difference in performance, but it made it easy to be able to take that system anywhere. So now that's the system that I take when I go back to LA, which right now, because of COVID, is not very often.
Right. Well, that's great that everything. Yeah, it's great that everything's pretty seamlessly transferable, and you can kind of pick up where you left off. I think it would be a good time to jump into some. Let's maybe share your screen, and if you want to show us some kind of how you have WaveLab laid out and any tips or tricks. I know WaveLab 10, as you know, opened up reference tracks, was probably a huge deal for you. I don't know if you're using reference tracks or if you're still using looks like you might be using a regular track.
It's funny. Yeah, I don't use reference tracks a lot, and not because it's just something that I've developed this workflow. So I'll kind of explain my workflow a little bit and why I work this way. So as a lot of people know, one of the really amazing things about the latest version of WaveLab is the ability to record back into a track in the audio montage. Now, for non-WaveLab users, that just sounds like something that every DAW automatically does. But from what I understand, WaveLab was initially just kind of set up as a 2-track editor. And I can't speak for the developer, but I just assumed they always thought people would figure out another way to capture their post analog chain, and then they would just import it into a montage. So for a long time, what I did was I would play back out of a montage and capture in a wave recording window on another version of WaveLab that I had running. So I would have 2 instances of WaveLab open. So typically I would have WaveLab 9, and then I would have a version of WaveLab 8 open that would just capture the track. Then I would copy it and drag it into the montage. So what I do now, and you can kind of see here, this is an EP I was working on last week. The top track here, these are the raw mixes. So what I like to do is I like to go in and assemble the album, and be able to work from, from an roughly assembled master. I think it's really important. One of the most overlooked parts of our job, especially as people start to enter the mastering world, and the younger engineers kind of often overlook that mastering, especially when you're mastering an album, this is about taking all of these tracks that were oftentimes kind of mixed out of context and not really referenced to one another, and making this sound like one cohesive unit. So it's really important. The most important part of this job is listening. So the audio montage allows me to assemble the record and just listen through the whole record a couple times to get the vibe. And does the spacing make sense? Do I have, I'll rough in general levels, and I'll explain this here in a second, how it relates to my analog gear as well. I want everything to sound as cohesive in the box before I even send it out through my analog chain. So what you're seeing here is on the top, these are the mixes, and on this bottom track, and I'll explain how I have effects and everything laid out. This bottom track, these are my analog captures. So I will play back, and I'll show you my routing here. Now I could go through and change all these names, but I don't bother. It's just the way I'm used to sending things routed. So essentially, the top channel comes out of what I call left front and right front. I use kind of a faux surround sound routing just because it's easier, and I know there's other ways to do it, but it's just kind of how I do it. So I'm going out of one set of converters that feeds one of the inputs of my mastering console. So the signal is coming out here, going through my mastering console, and then hitting my AD, and then I capture on this track. So this track, the outputs of this track are routed to my monitor DAC. So when I'm mastering a track, I can easily go back and A/B, and I do this, you can do it in WaveLab, but I do this in the analog domain on my console. I can A/B between this DAC and then this DAC and quickly hear the difference between my processed and unprocessed files. So in the audio routing, I'll just kind of show you how I have everything routed here. Again, you can go in and custom label all of this stuff, but I just for ease, I just use the left and right surround are actually my DAW outputs. So when I cut vinyl, I change these and I send them to a different DAC. Because I use the RME card, I have so many AES outs that I have a dedicated DAC just for the vinyl preview. So that's kind of how that's routed. So to kind of get into a little bit about my album mastering process and the way I use WaveLab. Like I said, one of the most important things is listening, and I'll go through and listen to the whole record a couple times, and then I'll sort of jump around just to get the vibe. And that also helps me determine where should I start. I don't necessarily start with the first song. So that just listening kind of helps me determine where I start. One of the features I love in WaveLab is the normalization feature. Now, I know there's going to be new mastering people and other people being, oh my God, Pete Lyman normalizes tracks. That's horrific. You can't normalize anything. Like, well, yeah. WaveLab does non-destructive normalization. So what I do is, and I guess I'll explain why I do this first. To me, analog processing is all about gain structure, and that's also another thing that's overlooked when people use analog gear. Without getting into super specific numbers, I know where I know what level to feed my chain, and I know where it sounds best. So in general, what I do is when I assemble the masters, and oftentimes my assistant does this for me, it's just an automatic process. We get the files from the client, we arrange them on a track, and then I use the meta normalizer feature to kind of go in and rough in the levels for the record. So I kind of want everything around 18, minus 18 LUFS as a starting point, because I know that that's going to hit my console at the level that sounds the best. So, and that's mostly just from years of pumping stuff through the console and figuring out the best gain staging for each piece of gear. So once we do that, I go in and I fine tune that by ear, because loudness is not, like, normalization is definitely no substitute for dialing in the tracks by ear. Obviously, there could be multiple tracks that measure the same volume, but as we know as mastering engineers, you could have one track that could be measure 4 dB quieter but could sound way louder because it has a much louder vocal, or it has a much sparser arrangement. So I use the normalization feature to ballpark everything, and you can see if you look at my clips, what the normalization feature does in WaveLab is it just adjusts gain. So that's all it's doing. So it's non-destructive, and that's one reason I really love doing most things inside the audio montage, because for the most part everything's non-destructive. If you don't like a volume change, you just go in and change it really quickly. Same with fades. So what we're seeing here in the inspector window, I spent a lot of time here. We've got clip-based effects, track-based effects, which there are none on my output track. And I rarely ever put anything on my output track. And that I'll explain why in a second. But you can see here, if we bounce back and forth between the clips, I have different effects there. And this is a very normal setup for me. So my philosophy in mastering is use the least amount of processing possible to get the best result. So oftentimes you'll see on a project, you'll see, for me, a FabFilter Pro Q3. These are very mild moves, less than half a dB. And FabFilter De-esser running on just the mid channel. And this is for vocals mostly. I do most of my other high frequency limiting in the analog domain. So another thing I like to do, again, try to tell everyone this is all about gain staging. There are obviously a million ways to do this, but what I automatically do is I apply a gain, WaveLab's gain plugin, and I knock down the gain roughly 6 dB before it hits my plugins, and then I boost it by the same amount. The reason I do that is that most mixes come in so hot these days that oftentimes by the time you start applying any processing, you're clipping in the box, which is, unless I'm going for an effect, is not necessarily something I want to do. Obviously, we've got a lot more headroom these days with floating point processing and everything, but I don't like to run any of my plugins that hot. So doing this allows me to get the headroom I need to apply any processing. So I might apply corrective EQ before it hits my analog chain, and I always apply de-essing before it hits my analog chain. So after it hits these plugins, it goes out through my gear, and then I capture down here. So I use the monitor function all the time while I'm capturing, and then I just turn it off when I want to play that track back. So that, and on this capture track, now I do this a couple different ways. I'm going to show you how I did it for this record. This EP came in, the mixes were very consistent. So I ended up using the same limiter for the whole record, which was the Pro L2. And I'm going to be honest with you, 1.7 dB of limiting is a lot for me. So I'm usually adding maybe an extra dB clip on the captured track. But oftentimes, if the mixes are really consistent, I find that using the same limiter just kind of helps me glue the entire record together. So having this limiter on the track, it allows me to listen to the process through limiting. And since it's applied on the track, when I capture the track, it doesn't apply that limiting. It doesn't freeze that limiting. It still allows me to turn it off, turn it on. So what I would go back when I go back and do a vinyl version of this record, I will disable any limiting and then further manipulate the montage, the captured montage from there to prep for vinyl.
Wow, that's a great overview. It's crazy how many things we do similarly, but WaveLab is so flexible. There's more than one way. There's more than 3 ways to do a lot of things in WaveLab. So, but in essence, we're doing the same thing. I'm also relieved to hear you mention that you're using the same limiter, final limiter on the whole EP, because I do that a lot. Because, like you said, it gives it a continuity. It's not right for every project, but if the mixes are dialed and you do a great job mastering it, I find that a common limiter setting does work. If it doesn't, I'm usually just driving maybe a little more of the capture into the limiter if it's too dynamic, or if it needs to relax the opposite direction. And then for me, the third option is, okay, I need to go. Even though I've massaged these mixes during mastering, occasionally you still need to go song by song with maybe some different attack and release settings. But I find that when you're doing everything else at a high level and everything's great, you can I don't want to say get away with that, because it's not like cheating. I think it's actually a good practice if it works out that way.
Yeah, I think so too. In general, I think there are a lot of mastering engineers that just tend to automatically over process. And I think you have to assume, unless the engineer says otherwise, at least with most of the projects I'm working with, I'm getting mixes after the engineer, producer, band signed off on them. Oftentimes 5 different A&R people, the label people. So I don't want them to deliver. If they're delivering, sending me an apple, I'm not going to send them back an orange. So the idea here is, for the most part, we're the auto detailers of the audio world. And again, oftentimes in mastering, our job is to leave no trace. Then there's other examples. I mean, the Sturgill record you were talking about, we went crazy in the mastering during the mastering process. I mean, that thing got printed to tape and manipulated more, and that was super fun. So there are times when we need to do that, but more often than not, we're just gluing this thing together, and tucking things a little bit, making sure things are consistent, fixing a few issues here and there. And, that's where this workflow really shines. And I think some folks tend to overthink this process a little bit, and and less is usually more in mastering.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you do need to get a little bit of a read on the project as far as what they're expecting. Are they expecting big changes? Or do they love the mixes and they just want your seal of approval? I mean, there's a kind of a range, and that can vary from client to client. You're doing, you're doing some, I would say, bigger artists who are working with, higher level producers, so everything's really dialed in. But for people that are working with sort of mid-level artists and people doing home recording and mixing, it can be a challenge to kind of suss out if they want you to transform this into a world-class production, or if they love it and they want it lo-fi and you're just kind of the quality control person and making sure it's going to sound good everywhere. There's a wide range of expectations and things like that in mastering. Do you have any processes that you use to figure out what your job is, or do you just work with the same? Do you work with the regular rotating crew of clients where you kind of already know that?
It's all about communication and developing relationships with the artist and the engineers and producers. So yeah, I mean, right now, I'm lucky that there are a lot of records I do that I'm fortunate enough to work with some of the best producers and mixers in the world. But, I mean, at the same time, I spent years working with only independent artists. And independent artists are always still my favorite to work with and my bread and butter. And, when you're dealing with new artists and younger bands and maybe artists that didn't have a huge recording budget and there were compromises that they made during that process, then of course the mastering is a whole other chance to take that project in the direction that that they sort of envisioned, even if maybe the mixes aren't quite there. So it's all about conversations and understanding your client. I mean, if I have a record that comes in and it's, I've explained this to my staff too, because we have so many great, I'm lucky enough to have a handful of really great engineers that work for Infrasonic, and some of us, myself and, mostly Dave Gardner out in Los Angeles, we come from punk rock backgrounds, and I love, we're into everything from outlaw country to black metal. And, I have if I created a musical playlist, it would be Hank Williams and then Throbbing Gristle and Burzum and Wu-Tang. So I know what a noise record's supposed to sound like. I know what a weird beach goth rock record is supposed to sound like. And I know what a polished country record is supposed to sound like. So I think it's important to just be a music fan too, to understand that when someone sends you a mix, if there's a ton of tape hiss or it's really dark, is that part of the aesthetic? It's important to know that. And if you're not sure, that's just part of the conversation you have with the client before you start the job.
Right. I mean, in mastering, I find I use mostly the same tools on every project, but I'm using them different. It's easier, even if it's a transparent pass through the analog gear. Do you just still do that just because it's easier for your workflow?
It depends. Well, a couple things. Yes, my workflow is always, I have a true hybrid setup. So I'm very accustomed to using my analog gear, and I'm actually a lot faster using my analog gear than I am if I have to do a project in the box. There are some projects that stay in the box, and the decision, a couple things that factor into that decision for me would be, okay, I know this producer really well, and this particular producer, their tracks are 98% there. It's really not going to change that much. The producer and the artist don't want it to change that much. They're hiring me for maybe a few little final touches, assembly and QC, and oftentimes that's the job. And there are a few producers out there that, and a handful of records I've done this year that have been completely flat transfers. Those records stay in the box. If a record comes in and it's already super limited and super hot, and that's what the client wants, that's probably not leaving the digital domain, because I find when a track is hyper limited and already kind of pushing that boundary anyways, just another round of conversion is going to do more damage to it.
Yeah.
So I don't think you should take something out of the digital domain just because you think it needs to go through analog gear to qualify or to justify the mastering process, which is a strange thing to me. Sometimes you just need to keep it digital.
Yeah, I agree. I found that as it gets pushed louder when stuff's coming in, it's more fragile. So you have to just be extra careful with handling it. Where, the mixes on your top track there, they look, pretty like there's a lot of headroom and a lot of dynamics left. So there was room to go analog. But I've certainly gotten mixes in that look more like your bottom track there. And it's like running that back through analog gear is probably going to do more harm than good. Even if you turn it down, there's this funny thing about how much headroom do mastering engineers need, and there's really no number. In fact, I wrote an article about it because I got tired of hearing about it. But I mean, in my opinion, as long as there's no limiting and it's not clipping, I can totally work with that. If there is limiting, as long as you love that and that's part of your sound, just know that I can't undo that because that's baked into it. So I was really glad to see you mention normalizing before you start. I do the exact same thing. And I think people do think of normalizing as an end process, but I think it's a really, really useful beginning process because then you can keep your analog gear, I don't want to say set the same, but your thresholds aren't moving wildly on your compressor and your de-esser and stuff like that. Everything's staying pretty cohesive and consistent. That allows you to do better work and be more efficient. And the other great thing about WaveLab too is, like you said, the normalization is non-destructive. So it's not degrading the file. It's not making copies upon copies of files. It's all really fast and direct. So even when you're doing a single song, you're using the montage as well, right?
Exactly. And, to kind of further elaborate on normalization for me, just to kind of clarify for people, I only use the normalization function really as a shortcut to make sure that I'm feeding my analog chain at the same level every time, usually.
Yeah, I do the same. It's a great starting point, and of course you fine tune it by ear because low end can play into what the normalizer thinks how loud it is and how it feels. But it's just a great shortcut. It gets you 90% there, and then you fine tune by ear before you start. And then even as you're working, if you make some big EQ changes, then suddenly maybe it can feed into the chain a little louder.
Yeah, and I would never normalize a mastered track because the normal, like I said, the normalization feature really only helps me ballpark signal into the chain. Everything else is by ear. I think, and this is a little bit of a rabbit hole and a side note, but I see a lot of talk online about, what target LUFS do you go for? And I could care less about LUFS. I'm a VU meter guy. I look at my VU meters all day long. I know in general how I have a calibrated listening level for the most part in my room. So I'm using a SPL meter and VU meters to determine how loud I want that record. LUFS really don't mean anything to me at all. So in getting kind of back to the headroom too, that's another myth that I always try to dispel. If you're mixing a track and delivering it to mastering, as long as you're not clipping the track and as long as you're not over limiting it, the overall peak level means nothing to the mastering engineer. So we just proved that when you use the normalization feature, we're changing the level anyways. It's easy for us to adjust the level of a mix in the workstation without doing any damage to it. So just make sure the tracks sound good when you're delivering them to the mastering engineer.
Yeah, I had a bizarre case where a client friend of mine sent me his client to master the track, but the artist was the one that sent me the file, and the mix file, it was so quiet I could barely see the waveform, and I'm like, I don't think this guy would mix this way because you'd have to have your speakers on 11 to even hear what you're doing. So I checked back, and for some reason the artist read online that mastering people needed so much headroom, and he brought it into Ableton and
Oh,
turned it way down. So I said, okay, I'm just going to go straight to the mix engineer. I got a file that it was a beautiful mix. There was no, I'm like, okay, so if you're reading stuff online, don't bring your mix engineer's mix into a DAW and just arbitrarily turn it down and then send it to, believe it or not, mastering engineers do have tools to, like you said, optimize the level before the processing. So, I mean, I think I'm just glad I caught that, but I'm like, there's no way this mix engineer would deliver a mix where you can barely see the waveform and hear it. I mean, I had to turn my speakers all the way up to hear it, and I'm like, this is just not right. Something's up.
probably a full 9 bits too.
Yeah, it was crazy. I want to get to the Q&A with some people that are watching, but I just wanted to talk about, you touched on sequencing the record. I found that most clients trust my judgment for adjusting the spacing between songs. They may have a note or two saying, can you crossfade songs 4 and 5, or could you leave a little extra space before this song because it's a slower thing? Do you ever have clients that give you kind of one long file as the whole layout because they have really specific ideas of how? But then, of course, they send you each mix disconnected, so you're not locked into that, but then you kind of recreate that.
Exactly. That happens a lot. I mean, I'm same boat as you. I love spacing and pacing a record. That's one of my favorite things about this job. And it's super important. So if a client's not particular about it, I usually nail it, and it's rare that we ever have any changes. But when a client is particular, they have a continuous album with crossfades, that's how I ask for it. I ask them to mock up one long track, even if it's an MP3, and then I would, for instance, on my mix track, I would load up all the mixes. Then I would have just a guide track, and we would go in by ear and obviously by eye and recreate that with their mixes. And when I print them, though, I print them without the transitions and then recreate them, just so I can always go back, because even if an artist sends you their sequence, it almost always changes, I found, on a continuous record. So I like to leave myself the ability to make that portion sort of non-destructive, so to speak. So I will capture the individual tracks in all their unedited glory, and then I will go back in and recreate that based on their guide track.
Yeah, I always leave myself kind of a safety exit strategy where if they need like one of the songs for a single where there's no overlap, it's very easy for me to just open the montage and get that back. I'm not having to recall any analog. It's very quick to just leave yourself a little bit of a safety net as far as that goes. And this is a place where you may want to use reference tracks, but I've been using reference tracks for that a lot. If they send me their continuous guide track, I usually just line it up visually, and then I can very quickly. And the cool thing with reference tracks is there's absolutely no danger of them being included in the rendering when you're done. And they're also not part of, the CD wizard. It doesn't latch onto the reference track for making markers, so you don't get like double markers. And it's the reference tracks, I think the reference track was mostly intended for audio comparisons, but I find it really useful for visual comparisons when I'm mocking up a client's, sequence where they have something in mind. But like you said, you always want to have your uncrossfaded versions for various reasons. For single usage, if they change their mind, then it's more of a 2-minute fix versus 20 minutes reprinting stuff.
Well, you're right too. With singles, oftentimes the bands might forget that they want clean edited singles for radio or whatever. So
yeah, you get that email 2 or 3 weeks later, and then same for vinyl. I've had people kind of chicken out where they sequence an album for vinyl with some cool crossfades, and then they kind of second guess themselves for the streaming version. And my opinion is just let the album be the album. I mean, listen to some Beatles and Pink Floyd records on streaming, and there's some awkward transitions, but if you intended the songs to crossfade, don't let a streaming service change your mind about that. I mean, it's just so we can make our master files be totally seamless, but what happens in the streaming world is a little bit unpredictable. Some streaming services have gapless playback. It's all going to depend on the device and the buffering and a number of things that are out of our control. So I say, if your album is going to have crossfades, let it have crossfades everywhere.
Agreed.
And the last cool thing about the Montage too, and where I see people struggle trying to use like a multi-track DAW, is when you're done with your record there, you can export any sample rate and bit depth all from the same source. So everything's cohesive. So if you have really precise transitions, you can be confident that whatever format you make, whether it's DDP, waves, the vinyl, everything is laid out the same, and there's going to be no surprises.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, that alone is amazing. And I'll save different. We'll have a 1644.1 montage always that we create DDPs from and standard wave files, but we always have the high, different versions of the high res montage to come back to.
Okay, well, cool. And last thing before we get into the Q&A is I work with a lot of independent and mid-level artists, and I'm kind of being a little bit, I don't want to say their manager, but I'm helping them, guiding them through the process of digital distribution and production of vinyl and CDs. And I'm a big fan of putting the metadata in the files just because WaveLab makes it so easy. I don't know, do you do much metadata, or do you keep everything clean and let more of the record labels handle that?
We let a lot of the record labels handle that. For independent clients, we'll talk to them and see if they need it. Frankly, most major labels don't want that. And even a lot of the major labels for DDPs, a lot of the major labels we deal with don't want CD text on the DDPs.
Okay, yeah, they might have in-house. I know one label I work with has an in-house, quality control department, and then they're probably sending out the actual production masters with, I try to be upfront and get all the correct titles from my clients, but things can change. But I was just curious how much of that you're adding in your files.
It depends on what the client wants. Sometimes indie clients, want everything, but at the same time, that metadata doesn't necessarily follow. So, I mean, if they want us to embed track names and ISRCs in a B wave, we do it. But they have to understand for the most part, if they're using, whatever independent digital distro they're using, that's something that will get handled on that end.
Yeah, they have to re-enter it all anyways. I guess I'm finding it more handy with like the reference MP3s. If they want to send the album for promo or friends and family, then the artwork shows up. And some people are using that for download cards. Cause that's one area where, obviously if digital distribution, they got to re-enter that information anyways. That's what appears on the streaming services. But the download cards for vinyl, they're usually just hosting the files that they get. And when you buy the vinyl, you get this download card and you get those files. So they like everything to look nice as if you purchased it. But anyway, let's get into some, unless you have any other things you want to add before we get into it.
Let's do it.
And this is something I've been meaning to study more, but do you have any experience or have you had to do any immersive or ambisonics type stuff for mastering, or are you strictly stereo right now?
Very little, except for the Sturgill project. I mastered that in surround in LA at Remote Control with Paco Cassette, who was the engineer on it. So Sturgill flew me out there to do that, which was hilarious because I've always kind of shied away from that, but it seemed interesting for this project. And he's like, "Do you want to master it?" I'm like, "I've never done surround." He's like, "Okay, we'll figure it out." So that was my first project, and I did that with Paco, and our friend Eva Reisted helped us out a lot, making sure everything was cool. But, Atmos is something that's interesting to me, and Infrasonic may be going down that path at some point.
Okay, that's interesting. I feel like surround was ready to take off in the early 2000s, and then the iPod came out and everyone's listening to stereo again in their earbuds. But now it's opening up again with, immersive audio, can be in headphones, and I'm very curious to see where it goes. I've done a couple myself, but it's always a little bit of a learning thing. Like, it's takes more time because you're troubleshooting and learning. Another question is, how do you approach or address records that need processing only on a specific section of a track, like an intro that has too much low end, but the rest of the record or song is fine?
You know, that's a good question. It depends. So I'll give you a couple examples how I may approach it. So I'm a big fan of corrective EQ in the box on the way out through the chain. Okay. And so, for instance, in the audio montage, I might edit a track and apply different effects on sections of those clips. So it's with WaveLab, it's very easy to just splice, for instance, a chorus section in a track and apply corrective EQ to that, and then to glue the track back together and run that whole track. If that doesn't work, I'll do that in the analog domain. And the way I do that is I'll print the track without doing the corrections to that section. And then I'll go back and change the settings on my analog gear, recapture that section, and then hand edit it back in. So that's a frequent way of doing it. It's just old school editing.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, I think clip effects are really underrated, and that's really what separates any mastering DAW from just trying to do it in a multi-track program, because you can really get in at the clip level and just address certain spots, and you can also be more efficient. I mean, I've seen people post pictures where they're mastering an album in a multi-track DAW and they got 12 tracks kind of stair-stepped, and the waveforms are like a centimeter, and how can you even see what you're doing? And it's pretty inefficient on your computer, because I can't speak for every DAW, but I feel like in a lot of cases, if you have 12 audio tracks for every song on the album, the CPU's getting hit for all those tracks, and it's easy to bog down your computer, whereas clip effects are so much more efficient. You can do a record on 1 or 2 tracks in the montage, and it's just super efficient visually and CPU-wise.
It gives me so much anxiety to see what you described when I see someone master when they're playing back out of Pro Tools or whatever, and they have like 12 to 15 different tracks and you can't see anything. And I couldn't work like that. There's no way that, I mean, the montage and clip-based effects, those things alone are worth the price of admission for WaveLab.
Exactly. And I don't even know if there is a limit of tracks in the montage, because I've only had to use more than a handful,
Yeah.
Typically I'm using 2 tracks in a montage because I like to just kind of stagger them. Even though you can crossfade, I like to just have the 2 track. But if an album has a goofy sound clip or something, I'll maybe go to 3, but it's rare to go beyond that. And so you still get a nice visualization about that. Here's a little left turn here. Which album was your favorite to master and why? And which artist would you like to work with that you haven't? I don't know if you can play favorites, but
oh man, it is so hard to pick a favorite record. It really is. There, and it's almost not fair to say it, but I can maybe give a handful of records. Recently, and this isn't necessarily, when I list these records, I'm kind of taking into account too the experience with the record, and not that it's just my favorite record, but I feel a really close connection to the new Chris Stapleton record, Starting Over. It was an interesting record to do in the middle of a pandemic. The mastering process was pretty intense. Chris has a very good ear and he's very particular about things. And we did that during a pandemic. Chris also lives in rural Williamson County with like a hard, it's hard to even get a good internet connection where he lives. So we were doing it old school, where we were mastering the record and cutting CDs for him. And because of COVID, we're like leaving CDs in a milk box outside the studio, and he's coming back to get them so we could do it that way, I'm really proud of the way that record turned out. Man, the list of records that like obviously I really love the work I've got to do with Sturgill. I was really excited to do Country Squire, Tyler Childers' last record. And that was one of those, to kind of sort of backtrack and answer a question of like artists that you really wanted to work with. Getting to do that record happened at a time where I really got into his first album, and I heard that record. I'm like, Jesus, this record is amazing. I want to work with this guy. Like, I would love to do a record for him. And I was working with Sturgill on Sound and Fury, and he was producing that record. He's like, oh, do you want to do Tyler's record? I'm like, oh my God, I'd love to. So that was kind of one of those things where I got, I really thought I would love to work with this artist, and I got to. And John Prine is a good example of that.
Yeah, it's very serendipitous where just you're in the right place and things are just kind of coming to you as they should be, it sounds like. And I know that's
go ahead. I was just going to say there are a number of records over the years that I feel really connected with. Even records that like weren't necessarily massive records, but over the years, there's a record I did with Butch Walker for like one of his solo records with his band, the Black Widows, called The Spade. And I love that record. It's still one of my references when I'm listening back to things I mastered. It's just, I'm a huge fan of Butch as a producer and an artist, and just as a person. So that was a really fun record to master. I kind of have fond memories of doing that, but there are so many records that I get to do that are really fun. All the records I do with Dave Cobb, and Vance Powell. It's really hard to name what my favorite records are.
You've got a nice flow, and I think sometimes people forget, with mastering, it's a fairly quick process. So I think you and I both, we're going through so many records in a week, in a month, in a year. It's hard to often remember sometimes. I mean, people ask me, if I've worked on anything good, and I sometimes have to look at my calendar and see what I did, because I don't know about you, but you can comfortably master an album in a day. Maybe there's a few revisions a few days later. So that's just a lot faster paced than, say, someone mixing and producing, where you spend weeks at a time with a record.
Yeah. I've recently I've done quite a bit of stuff for Trey Anastasio and Fish, and I have to say too, that stuff is really fun to do because Trey is really great to work with. He's such a nice guy. He's one of those guys you just feel, after a conversation with him, you just feel inspired. And he's very gracious, and he's just so musical. I mean, he's, genius musician. So talking to him is just inspiring, and it's really fun working on those records with him. This is a really enjoyable process.
Well, that's great. I mean, and for people that want to know more, I mean, you can go to, is it infrasonicssound.com? Is that?
Yeah. Infrasonic Sound, Infrasonic Mastering, both of those work.
Got a nice discography, and you got, I think, 3 or 4 engineers now. So you guys are, mastering's already busy, and then times that by 3 or 4 engineers. I mean, you guys are just doing a ton of stuff. So that's great. A few more questions if you have time. Let's see. Can multiband, and I'm reading this live, so I apologize if it's not a great question, but I think it's going to be good. Can multiband compression glue tracks better than wideband, and which is better, analog emulation or digital multiband compressor? Do you have the Mazalek multiband?
I don't
remember. Okay,
I've used it.
So any multiband you're doing is digital.
Correct.
Okay.
And any multiband I'm doing is very, very rare. If I'm using a multiband compressor, I am 90% of the time using that as a single band compressor to hone in on something specific. And then maybe another 5% of that time, I'm using a multiband compressor mostly as a broadband EQ. I'm not a big fan of multiband compression at all. I think it's an overused tool, and I think that to me, if you're getting into extreme multiband compression, you're sort of at a point where you need to go back to the mix. Now, yeah, there are certain genres of music that people expect multiband compression, electronics, dance music. I understand it's a big tool, in that realm. I don't do a lot of that, and I have other ways to kind of deal with audio like that dynamically. But not a big fan of multiband compression. When I do use it, I find myself using the Fab Filter stuff. And lately, when I have had to use it a couple times, and this is kind of getting back, to more WaveLab specific question, but one of the really fun things in WaveLab 10 is the master rig. And I don't know, Justin, how much you've messed with that. And typically, I'll preface this by saying I've always shied away from stock DAW plugins until I started using the master rig. If I do multi-band processing, oftentimes in the master rig, I've had the multi-band saturation tool save my ass a number of times in the last year. And that does some things that I'm just unable to do with any other tool.
Yeah, the master rig is very powerful. I had to dig into it more when I was teaching at the tech school, because we were using WaveLab, but of course the school didn't have third-party plugins, so I had to really explore master rig more than I ever had, and I was super impressed with how powerful it is. And I like that, if I remember correctly, the multiband doesn't start out with 5 bands. It starts out very sparse, and you can add more bands, because I always say just because it's a multiband compressor doesn't mean you have to use all the bands. I'm also using maybe 1 or 2 at the most, and the rest are bypassed if I'm even using it.
And one dirty little secret, since we're talking about compression, I think everyone thinks compression is something that is always used in mastering. Now, obviously, we can talk about the differences between compression and limiting. I would say 80% of the masters I do, if not more, I'm not applying any compression at all.
Right.
I don't automatically. I might run through one of my compressors, like my master bus processor, and I'm using that as a gain stage. Or if I have an unfair child too that I might use just strictly for the transformer tube thing it kind of does. So, but I'm not actually compressing anything. I do a lot more limiting. My Spectrasonics I use a lot early in my chain for peak limiting, but I think compression is overused in mastering.
Yeah, overused and over assumed. I'm in the same boat where if my gain reduction meters are even moving the slightest bit, that's a lot. And if I'm using the hardware, it's more for gain staging and the tone of the unit, and very little actual gain reduction. And the other kind of unspoken thing to kind of double onto that is I do a lot. I find myself doing more and more volume automation. If a mix is too dynamic, I'll just go into the montage on the clip and automate up the quiet section. Or in the opposite sense, if a verse needs to relax a little more, I can just draw it down. I prefer to do it more just with level automation than trying to, use a tool that's too heavy-handed. Just keep it simple. Use some volume gain, volume automation, basically.
I do the same thing. I also when I'm compressing in the analog domain, I will also use automation in WaveLab to essentially adjust the threshold of that compressor without having to manually adjust it.
Yeah, so the automation on clips is super powerful. Let's see. Oh, Phil DeMetro just had I thought it was going to be a question, but he just had a comment. So it's good to hear from Phil. Let's see. I want to do one more. There was a good one about upsampling. So what's your opinion on upsampling to higher resolution if stuff comes in lower? Do you upsample automatically, or do you like to work at the native sample rate?
I work at the native sample rate. Okay. Here's why. I do a lot of major label work. And if I get mixes in that are 48 and I do them at 96 and we deliver 96K HD files, they kick them back. So it's not, if it's not true HD, and for instance, if they're submitting these tracks to HD tracks, they've had complaints where customers have downloaded files that say 96K files, which, and they're really only 48. So I tend to work at the native sample rate. Now, an exception would be if I get a project in at mixed sample rates where 4 songs are at 48 and the rest is at 96, I will upsample those.
Yeah, that makes sense to be at a common sample rate.
Yeah.
At some point you're going to have to be anyway, so you may as well get it from the start.
Yeah.
This is a good one to wrap it up with, I think, unless I come across any others. But what does a typical day look like for you guys, your whole team? Do you like to flow through the sonic aspect of a project early in the day and then handle the admin type details later on? Or what's kind of your process of getting a record when you get I like to speak from even though a lot of singles are being done, from an EP or an album context.
Sure. Well, I'm fortunate enough now to have a really great team that helps me with a lot of the more mundane aspects of this job. So we truly tackle a record as a team here. So for instance, a normal day, and let's just use a full-length record as an example. I come in and usually have a quick meeting with my assistant and my manager, and we talk about what's going on that day. I immediately just start listening to the record. So usually what I like to do is I like to kind of go through and at least do a quick email check in the morning. And one of the things I love to do is just to sort of passively listen to the record that I'm working on without thinking too much about it. So we've got it sequenced in WaveLab. The levels I'm going to feed the chain are already kind of ballparked. I go in and just listen as I'm answering emails. And oftentimes things will just catch my ear just as I'm off access over here, and just kind of absorbing it that way. And then I shut the computer down and I go back and I really listen. As I'm listening, I'm kind of, sort of getting overall gain staging set up through my chain. And then I start making decisions. So in general, like I start off the day just by listening to the project, then I dig right into audio processing. So a good example of my workflow would be, for a lot of albums, I may not even change the settings on my analog gear that much. So if the album is really consistent, a lot of those changes are happening in the workstation, and that allows me to jump back and forth on that album to different tracks and sort of have the advantage of hearing in real time what's happening without having to make a million hardware changes. And it's almost like the same advantage you get to when you're working in the box. So it's sort of a hybrid approach. And then when I get closer to finishing the record, there'll be more small changes on the analog desk that I'll make and more tweaks digitally. And then I track all of my settings using Session Recall. So there's a great software. I think you use it too, Justin, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine what life was like before it, really. It's really great software, Session Recall.
Papers. That's what
and the developer is very responsive. If you have a suggestion, he's usually very fast to add it to the collection. And what I really like too is he added PDF export, because so there's some people that say, well, what are you going to do when the app doesn't exist anymore? And hopefully it always exists, but as a backup, you can export all your settings as a PDF, and you can store it right in your folder. But I don't want to interrupt what you were saying, but Session Recall is great.
Yeah, so I'll go through and I just start digging into the processing. And once I get everything set and I make notes, most of the time, my assistant Dan will then step in and he will capture the audio for me. Okay. And the reason I do that well, there's a couple of reasons I do that is, and we didn't touch on this a lot, but QCing is the most important part of our job. We go overboard with quality checks here. So one of the reasons I don't just have my assistant capture these tracks because I'm being lazy about it. I have him capture them because it's a whole other driver. It's a whole other person. Now they're not making any dynamics decisions or anything. They're recalling everything based on my notes, but it gives them the advantage of hearing things. And then maybe there's a few things that, since I was kind of listening at more of a higher level for vibe, my assistant will be more honed in on, oh, there's a few little noises we need to go back and remove. And then once the record's captured, they'll go in and we'll remove those. We might use either the Spectral Editing or a third-party program like RX to fix a few little things, like maybe there were bad vocal edits or little ticks and pops. Then I go back, listen to the whole record again. I might make a few final adjustments to that montage. Then we render it and we send out references to the client.
Okay, yeah, and I'm glad you touched on quality control because that's such a big part. You know, you actually have to listen to the files that you produce, not just as it's playing through your DAW, but the actual files that you're going to send out to your client or record label. You need to listen to those to make sure there's not an error, because that's probably it's very embarrassing if there is. And hopefully if you have these systems in place, there never are, but that's probably a good way to not get hired again. And it's just bad overall.
Yeah, I remember when I was still on Facebook, I was talking to someone on one of the mastering forums, and there was an engineer who basically, I think the question was, the subject might have been about mastering engineers charging for different master parts. Now, we have a way of working where I basically charge based on the overall time of the record, the length. And we also we kind of offer an a la carte service, and we charge for individual production parts. The reason we do that is because not everyone needs every production part. So even though a digital workstation, even though WaveLab can spit out 5 different formats at once, what the client is paying for is the quality control and our ears. So we go through and quality check everything multiple times to make sure that it's good. I mean, there are unfortunately engineers out there that when the project's done, they have macros set up, they hit 1 or 2 buttons, they spit out a bunch of different parts, and they give all these parts to the client. Now, if that's an indie release and there's only 500 copies of a CD and it's going digital and a little error gets out, maybe that's easily corrected. But if we're cutting a DDP for a record that's going to sell 4 million copies and there's an error on it, that's a different story. So quality, the quality and QC process is the most important thing.
Yeah, and that's one area where I do use the audio editor in WaveLab, is listening back. The audio editor is a great place to listen back to your files because you get some analysis and stuff like that. But as we mentioned, the montage is the way to go. Do you have time for a couple more?
Yeah, we're good.
We'll cut it off at noon our time, okay, Central Time. But Phil actually did have a question. I didn't read his whole comment. Do you know Phil DeMetro, Canada?
I think we've probably chatted on Gear Sluts or something. I know who he is, and I've seen his name on Gear Sluts. Hey, Phil.
Another longtime WaveLab user, but his final comment was, what is your analog signal path, if you are able to take us through that?
Sure. In general, my analog signal path, we'll go over the converters and everything in a minute, but I use a Masilic MTC1 console, same as yours, except I have the original one, not the X. In general, and I never publish any of the gear I use because none of that makes sense to me, but my path, again, it's all about gain staging. The first thing in my path are a pair of custom racked UTC 108X transformers that I usually run at 2-to-1. So it comes in, signal comes into my console, hits those transformers, and then immediately hits a dangerous backs EQ, which I pretty much only use for the high frequency cuts. I usually just keep that engaged at 70K, just helps clean things up a little bit as they go through the chain. And then I have I always mispronounce it. I think it's NIF, the NIF Soma Tube EQ. Is that right? Is that how you pronounce it?
That's how I say it when I read it on the internet, but I haven't used any NIF stuff yet. I've heard great things.
It's magic. Unbelievable. This EQ is unbelievable. And the build quality is, if you look at it, like, the guy must be a madman, and I love it because the build quality is unbelievable. I absolutely love that EQ. It's a big part of my sound. From there, I hit a pair of Spectrasonics V610 limiters that Bill at Spectrasonics custom built for me. Have slightly different input threshold and custom faceplates and a few other goodies that I worked with him to kind of modify. So I do a little bit of light. I only use those as peak limiters. I rarely use them as compressors. So that's kind of part of my whole gain staging philosophy. They hit these things as like a safety peak limiter, just helps clean it up, and it's almost inaudible. From there, we hit my Magnum K comps, which again, another unbelievable compressor. And I use those. The most powerful part of that is kind of the smallest part of the circuit, what they call the K comp, which is just sort of a fixed compressor that sort of suppresses that kind of 2.5, 3K harshness. And I'm able to dial that in. And I can even kind of push EQ into that to have it kind of restrain it a little bit when I need to. And then, of course, the air band is amazing on that. Then from there, it goes into my Unfairchild. So I've got an Undertone Audio Unfairchild with the expansion box that makes it a lot more versatile because I have high pass filtering on the side chain. I can turn it into more of a feed forward style compressor, parallel blends. It's really unbelievable sounding compressor. Then it goes into a Magnum EQ, a Mag EQ4, which is my favorite. I mean, for the airband alone, it's great. And that's a tool I use a lot for vinyl mastering because Cliff, who invented these things, and also the company is so amazing. I don't know if you've ever talked to those guys, but it's a true family company out in Utah. They're just the coolest people ever and really passionate about what they do. And the airband was originally created for vinyl mastering to try to regain the sort of airiness without adding harshness and making it difficult to cut. And I use that on every vinyl cut I do. So the last piece of my chain that I normally don't advertise, but the last piece of my analog chain is high frequency limiting. I use a modified E-Tech limiter, which was built by a company named Ortofon, and it was built specifically for vinyl cutting. I've used it on every digital master I've done in the last 10 years. So it's sort of a set frequency, high frequency limiter. It does have low frequency limiting. It does have a circuit on it where you can limit the low frequency stuff. Again, more suited for cutting, but the high frequency limiter is fantastic. And then I've got a bunch of custom routing on my console. I have a custom master fader here on my console, which is really handy for all analog mastering. I have a bunch of high quality passive switches that I use for routing that were custom built. Converters, I use a lot of different converters. I have my console is set up so that I can instantly audition between my Burl DACs and my Crane Song DACs on a song-by-song basis.
Yep.
So I can just, because I have the RME card, I can run multiple feeds at the same level to multiple DACs and just switch without any issues, and everything's run off the same clock.
That's great. And I don't want to interrupt. I'm going to interrupt, but I think that's one thing I love to do too. And, you know, all these DACs, they all sound amazing, but I think when you can compare in real time without any interruption, you might find that one suits a particular song or project more than the other. And it's not that one's bad and one's amazing, but it's like I think this one is more favorable to this song. And when you can do it in real time, the differences become very obvious versus like repatching and stopping playback and crawling under the desk, and then you're going to forget what the other one sounded like. But when you're when you're in the zone and can compare, it's very advantageous.
I might do the same thing on the ADC side too. I'm in love with the new Rupert Neve MBC. Unbelievable converter, very versatile. But there's a bunch of ADCs I love. I mean, I've been a Burl user for a really long time, so I might switch between the MBC and the Burl depending on the vibe. I also have a Crane Song head that sounds very, very good. So like you said, there's a lot of really great stuff out there, and I like the ability to be able to audition different things depending on the project and the type of music.
Yeah, I have a few ADCs, and I actually just got the Neve in on Friday. I haven't spent much time with it yet, but sometimes it's fun to set one up to be a little more colored. You know, the head has some coloration, the Neve does. And if there's a set of tracks on a record that need a little more edge, you know, you can have it queued up for those, and it's just really handy to have a few different flavors. They're all good, they're just different flavors.
Yeah. And on the analog side for playback, kind of hard to see over here, but I actually have a bunch of really cool options. So I have a pretty tricked out ATR that I've got the normal cards for, and then I also have the mastering playback cards for that give me a little bit more range and a little tweakability. And about a year ago, I had Chris Mara make a custom Mara machines for me that has a vinyl preview path. So it has a pretty tricky tape path that creates the delay that we talked about, and a separate set of heads and electronics that allow me to do all analog vinyl mastering. The other cool thing about that machine is I had him modify the repro head so it has a little jumper where I can bypass the MCI electronics and run straight out into a pair of custom Ampex 440s that I had modded. And then I've got some other playback options that I'm having built for this thing too. So it gives me like 3 or 4 different analog tape playback flavors as well.
That's great. Well, it sounds like you're prepared for pretty much any situation. So thanks for taking us through that. That was Phil's question. Here's a truly good final question, and we'll wrap it up and let you get on with your day. But Rafa, I'm not sure where Rafa is from, but if somebody wanted to get into mastering, what advice would you give to get started in mastering?
I think it's important to really learn all aspects of all the technical aspects of this business. I think if you want to get into mastering, you need to spend some time in recording studios, maybe find an internship at a recording studio, learn the nuts and bolts of making a record. One of the important parts of our job is educating clients and walking them through the manufacturing process. And in order to do that, you really need to understand how a record gets made. So you got to figure out how the sausage is made first. So I think that's the best first step. Once you have a little bit of that experience under your belt, then you just need to start pounding the pavement and reaching out to mastering houses and trying to find an internship and learning as much as you can on your own. But be prepared. It's very competitive. I have to say, we've taken on a lot of interns over the years, and I find that, there are a lot of people wanting to get into this, and there are very few people that have the constitution to do this job. So I would say out of our interns, a couple of them, like we've had over the last years, have been amazing. And, but there's always a handful that you realize early on, like this person is not going to be in this industry for very long. So if you're not, just in the music industry in general, if you're not ready to sacrifice your entire life to do this job, and I mean your entire life, your job security, your family, oftentimes your housing. When I started my first recording studio, I sold my house and I moved into a closet. I lived in a closet
Wow.
with friends to do this job, to build my studio. This is a hard job, and we work crazy hours and we sacrifice a lot. So if you think you want to get into mastering because you heard it's a more 9 to 5 job, it's like, well, yeah, at my level right now it is, because I've been doing this for half my life. But you need to be prepared to really sacrifice everything for this craft. And if you're looking for an internship, people are looking for that sort of quality, and if you're not willing to do that, then it's going to be hard to even find an internship.
Yeah, some of the best intern stories I've heard are just start showing up and make yourself, invaluable or irreplaceable, where you have to just keep going or they're going to suffer, or it's going to be more challenging for them. Just make yourself valuable and do your best work. So I think that's a great place to wrap it up. I really appreciate your time today. I know we went a little long, but I could talk about WaveLab and mastering all day. So we should probably stop it here. But if you have any final thoughts, that's great. Otherwise, maybe we can do this again sometime down the road. And
I'd love to. I'm really excited that you're doing this. I've been, I'm obviously really passionate about mastering, but I'm really passionate about WaveLab. I think it's a great tool. And I like spreading the word. I think that, and the folks at Steinberg are great people that are obsessed with quality.
Yep.
And I love that. So I'm just happy to be involved, and thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
No problem. Have a good weekend, good holidays coming up, and we'll catch up next year. All right. Have a good one.